The restaurant went silent the moment David Reeves walked through the door, not because they were happy to see him, because they weren't. 5 years. 5 years of silence, of block numbers, of a life he'd built alone in the dark. And now he stood at the entrance of Bellagio's, watching his family celebrate his son's 16th birthday like he was a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. Carol saw him first. Her fork froze halfway to her mouth. "Unbelievable," she muttered, not even bothering to whisper. The family failure finally crawled back. David didn't flinch. He'd expected worse. Emma looked up next, 19 years old and wearing the same contempt her mother had spent 5 years teaching her. "Wow, life's been so much better without you, you know that?" "Happy to hear it," David said quietly, pulling out a chair no one offered him. Tyler, the birthday boy, didn't even look up from his phone. "Don't ruin my birthday, man, seriously." "I'm not here to ruin anything, Tyler. I'm here because it's your birthday." Tyler finally raised his eyes, and there was nothing in them. No warmth. No memory of a father who used to carry him on his shoulders. Just calculation. "You want to stay? Fine. Shut up, sit down, and pay the bill. Least you can do after 5 years of being a disappointment." The table laughed. Carol smiled into her wine glass. Emma didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. David looked at each of them, one by one. His wife, his daughter, his son. Strangers wearing familiar faces. Then he smiled. Slow, quiet, almost peaceful. "Fine," he said, standing up and straightening his jacket. "Last time you'll ever see me." He turned and walked out. No slammed doors, no raised voice. Just the quiet click of dress shoes against marble and the sound of Carol's laughter chasing him into the night. In the parking lot, David sat in his car for exactly 11 seconds before pulling out his phone. He didn't call an old friend. He didn't call a therapist. He called a lawyer. "Nina, it's David." A pause. "It's time. Move on the Hale file." On the other end, silence. Then Nina's voice, sharp and awake. "You're sure? Once this starts, there's no stopping it." David looked back at the restaurant window, where his family sat laughing under warm gold light, utterly unaware that the ground beneath them had just shifted. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." He hung up. Behind that restaurant window, Carol raised her glass for a toast. Emma laughed at something Tyler said. None of them noticed that the man they'd just humiliated wasn't walking away. He was walking toward something, and in exactly 1 week, everything they thought they owned, the house, the company, the comfortable lie they'd built his failure on, would no longer be theirs. Nina Cole's office smelled like old paper and stronger coffee than most people could stomach. She'd been David's lawyer for 5 years. Longer, really, if you counted the years before everything fell apart, back when David still had a company with his name on the door. She slid a folder across the desk. "You've had this leverage for 5 years, David. Why now? Why tonight?" David didn't open the folder. He already knew every page inside it by heart. "Because tonight I watched my son ask me to pay a bill like I was a waiter," he said. "Because my daughter looked at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. Because Carol called me a failure in front of people who don't even know my real name anymore. You could have ended this 2 years ago. I know. So why didn't you?" David finally opened the folder. Inside, bank statements, forged signatures, a trust document dated 5 years back. His hands didn't shake anymore when he looked at it. That had taken years. "Because some part of me kept hoping they'd figure it out on their own," he said quietly. "That they'd wonder why the divorce papers never had my real signature. That they'd ask why the company didn't collapse the way everyone said it did. I kept waiting for someone, anyone, to ask the right question. Nobody asked. Nobody asked. 5 years earlier. It started small, the way betrayal always does. Carol stayed late at board meetings that didn't exist. Richard Hale, David's business partner, suddenly handled more of the company's finances than David had ever authorized. Then the scandal broke. Falsified expense reports, missing funds, a mess so tangled that even David's own accountant couldn't find the bottom of it. The board wanted someone to blame. Carol wanted someone to blame. It was easier if that someone was David. He remembered the divorce papers arriving by courier, remembered signing nothing, remembered Carol's voice on the phone. Ice cold. "It's already done, David. Fighting it will just make you look guiltier." He remembered walking out of his own company for the last time, humiliated, disgraced, branded a failure by people who had engineered his downfall to cover their own. What Carol never knew, what Richard never knew, was that David had spent the 3 months before the scandal broke quietly moving his shares into an irrevocable trust. Not out of foresight, out of a gut feeling he couldn't name at the time, a small cold voice that whispered, "Something is wrong here." He let them think he'd lost everything. He let them think he'd run because he was broken. He needed them to believe it completely, because the moment they stopped believing it, they'd stop being careless. Back in the present, Nina tapped the folder. The trust reclamation filing goes out tomorrow morning. Once it's filed, Carol gets served. There's no version of this where she doesn't find out everything. Good. And Richard Hale's embezzlement paper trail, the one tied to Carol's signature on 3 shell transfers. David's jaw tightened just slightly. Send that too. All of it. Nina studied him for a long moment. You know, this doesn't just hurt Carol. It hurts Emma, Tyler. They're going to lose the house, the cars, everything they think is theirs. David thought of Tyler's voice and shut up, sit down and pay the bill. And Emma's. Life's been better without you. They already decided who I was, David said, standing. Now they can live in the world they built. He walked to the door, then stopped, his hand on the frame. Send the notice to the house, Nina. Not the office. I want her to open it at her own kitchen table. Nina nodded slowly. It's going to look like an ordinary envelope. David allowed himself the smallest, coldest smile of the night. Good. Let her open it, thinking it's nothing. The next morning, a plain white envelope sat on the doorstep of the Reeves house, wedged between the newspaper and a flyer for a pizza place. Carol picked it up on her way to get coffee, barely glancing at the return address, a law firm she didn't recognize. She had no idea that inside that envelope was the first thread of a rope that would unravel everything she'd spent 5 years building on a lie. She tore it open at the kitchen table, still in her robe, still smiling from the night before. Her smile didn't survive the first paragraph. Carol read the first line twice before her brain accepted what her eyes were seeing. Notice of trust reclamation and asset reversion. Reeves Family Trust. Estrati. 5 years prior. Her coffee mug slipped from her hand and cracked against the tile. What is this? She whispered, flipping to the second page, then the third. Legal language she didn't fully understand, but understood enough. Property, shares, accounts, all of it listed under a trust she'd never heard of, one that predated the divorce. She grabbed her phone and called Richard before she'd even processed what she was about to say. Richard, I need you at the house, now. Richard Hale arrived 20 minutes later, still in his golf clothes, irritation written across his face until he saw hers. What's wrong? She shoved the letter into his chest. He read it standing in the kitchen, his expression shifting from confusion to something colder. This is impossible, Richard said. Everything's in your name. The house, the investment accounts, my stake in... It was never in my name, Richard. Carol's voice cracked, thin and sharp. I just told you it was. Richard went still. What? The house was in David's name from the original purchase. I never refiled it after the divorce. There wasn't time. I told you I'd handled it. Her hands were shaking now. I thought it didn't matter. I thought he was gone. Richard's face was drained of color. You told me we were protected. You told me the company shares were clean, that nothing could trace back to... I know what I told you. The kitchen went silent, except for the tick of the wall clock. The same clock David used to fix every few months because it always ran slow. Richard set the letter down like it might bite him. If this trust is real, if he's had control of the shares this entire time, then every transfer we made, every account we moved money through... Don't. Carol's voice was a warning. Carol, every transfer has your signature on it. If he can prove the trust predates the divorce, he can prove you had no legal authority to sign off on any of it. The two of them stood in silence, the weight of 5 years of careless comfort finally starting to crack beneath their feet. Upstairs, Emma sat on her bed, half listening through the floor vents the way she had since she was a kid, eavesdropping on arguments she wasn't supposed to hear. She caught fragments. Trust, shares, signature, fraud. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough to feel something cold settle low in her stomach. The same feeling she used to get right before her parents fought about money, back before her father disappeared. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Your father filed something. Ask your mother what irrevocable trust means before you decide who the failure really is. No name, no explanation. Emma stared at the screen for a long moment before deleting it, telling herself it didn't mean anything. 3 days later, Tyler's world cracked open in front of his entire school. He'd been bragging all week about the car his mother promised. A birthday gift to make up for the disaster dinner, she'd called it, blaming David entirely for ruining the night. The car had arrived Tuesday. Tyler had driven it to school Wednesday, parked it right at the front like a trophy. Thursday, a flatbed tow truck pulled into the school parking lot during lunch. Tyler watched through the cafeteria window, phone frozen in his hand, as 2 men in uniforms hooked up his car while half the junior class filmed it on their phones. "Repossession," one of the men said flatly when Tyler ran outside, humiliation burning hotter than anything he'd ever felt. "Accounts flagged. The whole thing's part of an asset freeze. Talk to your parents." Tyler stood in the parking lot as his brand new birthday gift rolled away on the back of a truck. 30 phones recording every second of it, already halfway to being posted online. He called his mother, voice shaking with something between rage and panic. "Mom, what is happening? They took my car in front of everyone." Carol's voice on the other end was tight, brittle. "It's your father, Tyler. He's doing something legal. I don't fully understand it yet." "Doing what? Why?" There was a long pause. When Carol finally spoke again, her voice had lost all its usual certainty. "I think," she said slowly, "he's taking back everything we thought was ours." Tyler stood in the empty parking spot where his car used to be, the last of the crowd finally dispersing, and felt, for the first time in 5 years, a flicker of something he didn't recognize. Fear. By Friday, the Reeves house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict everyone already knew was coming. Carol hadn't slept. She sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers she didn't understand, calling lawyer after lawyer, getting the same answer each time. The trust predates the divorce. The shares were never legally yours to transfer. You need your own representation immediately. Emma found her there at 2 a.m., mascara-streaked and hollow-eyed. "Mom, what did you do?" Carol looked up, and for a moment, just a moment, the mask slipped completely. "I did what I had to do to survive after your father destroyed this family." "Did he, though?" Emma's voice was quieter than she meant it to be. "Because I got a text 3 days ago. Someone told me to ask you what an irrevocable trust means." Carol's face went white. "Who sent you that?" "I don't know. I deleted it." Emma sat down across from her mother, hands trembling slightly. "But it's been eating at me, Mom. Ask me why." Carol said nothing. "Because you've never once told me the whole story of what happened 5 years ago," Emma continued. "Just that Dad failed, Dad ran, Dad left us. But nobody ever explained why the divorce happened so fast, why we moved, why did Richard suddenly have an office in Dad's old company." "Emma, just answer the question, Mom. What's an irrevocable trust?" Carol didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was the loudest confession she'd given in 5 years. Emma found David 2 days later, not through Carol, not through any family connection, but through an old employee directory she remembered from childhood, a single email address that miraculously still worked. They met at a coffee shop across town. Neutral ground. David looked different than she remembered. Calmer, harder, like a man who'd stopped needing anyone's approval a long time ago. "Dad, please," Emma started, her voice already cracking. "We didn't mean it. What we said at the dinner, we were caught up in—" "You meant every word," David said quietly, no anger in his voice, just fact. "You just didn't mean for it to cost you anything." Emma flinched like she'd been slapped. "That's not fair." "No," David agreed. "It's not. None of this has been fair for 5 years. Please, Dad, whatever's happening, whatever you're doing to Mom, can you just stop? Tyler's a wreck. He hasn't left his room in 2 days." David studied his daughter for a long moment. There was something almost genuine in her panic, something that hadn't fully calcified the way Carol's had. Maybe there was still something worth salvaging in her. Maybe not. He wasn't ready to decide yet. "Emma, I'm going to ask you something. And I need you to actually think before you answer." He leaned forward. "In 5 years, did you ever once ask your mother to show you proof? Divorce papers with my actual signature? A single financial document explaining what really happened to the company?" Emma opened her mouth, then closed it. "No," David said softly. "You didn't, because it was easier to believe I was the villain than to ask questions that might make you responsible for anything." He stood, dropping cash on the table for coffee neither of them had touched. "Tell your mother I said hello," he said, "and tell her the next envelope arrives Monday." That night, David sat across from Nina in her office one last time before the final filing. "Richard Hale's fraud case," Nina said, sliding a final document across the table. "Once this goes to the DA, it's out of your hands completely. Criminal charges, not civil. Carol's name is on 3 of the transfers." David nodded slowly. "Criminal. You understand what that means for her? For the kids watching their mother potentially face real charges?" David was quiet for a long moment, staring at the paper that would end Carol Reeves' carefully constructed life. "I understand," he said finally, "that 5 years ago I sat in a car outside my own company with nowhere to go, and not one person in that house called to ask if I was okay." He signed the document. "Send it Monday," he said. "At the birthday redo party?" Nina raised an eyebrow. "The makeup party? You know about that? Carol posted about it online 3 hours ago. Making up for a rough week with the people who matter." David's voice was flat, unreadable. "Let her have her party. Let her smile for the cameras one more time." He stood to leave, pausing at the door. "Then let the process server walk in right as she's cutting the cake." Carol had rebuilt the party like she was rebuilding her whole life. Brighter, louder, more curated. String lights over the backyard. A professional cake with Tyler's name in gold lettering. A dozen family friends invited specifically so word would spread. The Reeves family is fine. Better than fine. She needed people to see this. She needed it more than she'd admit. Tyler stood near the dessert table, still rattled from the repossession video that had ballooned to thousands of views online, forcing a smile for his mother's sake. Emma stood near the back fence, arms crossed, watching everything with new eyes, the eyes of someone who'd started asking questions and couldn't stop. "Everyone, gather around!" Carol called out, clapping her hands, her smile stretched tight and bright. "Let's sing to my amazing son." The group began singing. Tyler stood over the cake, candles flickering, forcing himself to look happy for the phones raised around him. That's when the gate creaked open. A man in a plain gray suit walked through, holding a clipboard, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on Carol. Carol Reeves. The singing faltered, then stopped completely. "Yes," Carol said, her smile cracking at the edges. "You've been served." He held out an envelope. "This is formal notice of criminal referral regarding fraudulent asset transfers under case number." "Not here," Carol hissed, snatching the envelope, but it was too late. Half the party had already heard the word criminal. Phones that had been recording the birthday song were now recording something else entirely. Richard, standing near the drinks table, went pale and quietly slipped toward the gate himself, only to find another man waiting for him there. "Richard Hale? I need to speak to my lawyer before you've been served as well." A second envelope changed hands. Richard's face went the color of ash. Tyler stood frozen over his own birthday cake, candles still burning, watching his mother's hands shake as she opened an envelope in front of 30 guests who would all tell this story for years to come. "Mom," Tyler said quietly, "what does criminal referral mean?" Carol didn't answer. She was staring at the paper, the same cold dread Richard wore now written across her own face. Emma walked up slowly, reading over her mother's shoulder. The shell company names, the falsified signatures, her own mother's name attached to numbers that made her stomach turn. "You told me Dad ruined this family," Emma said quietly, almost to herself. "You told me he was a failure." Carol looked up, panic overtaking her practiced composure. "Emma, it's not what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like." Emma's voice shook, but it didn't waver. "You forged his signature. You took his company. You let us hate him for 5 years for something you did." The backyard had gone completely silent, except for the faint hiss of the birthday candles slowly burning down. Tyler looked between his mother, frozen and pale, and his sister, tears streaming, but her jaw set with something like fury. "Somebody needs to explain this to me right now," Tyler said, his voice cracking. "All of it." Nobody answered. Later that night, long after the guests had fled and the cake sat untouched and half-melted on the table, Carol sat alone in the wreckage of her curated party, staring at her phone. Her thumb hovered over David's contact, a number she hadn't dialed in 5 years, saved under a name she'd once spat out with contempt. Him, she typed with shaking hands. "Where are you? They're losing it. Please call." She hit send and waited, staring at the screen, watching the message sit there. Delivered. No reply came. Not that night. Not the next morning. Somewhere across town, David Reeves sat in his own apartment. Phone lit up on the table beside him, Carol's message glowing on the screen. He didn't reach for it. He simply looked at it, the first time she'd needed him in 5 years, and let it sit there, unanswered, exactly the way his own calls had once been, left to die in silence. 3 days passed before David finally called back. Carol answered on the first ring, breathless, desperate. "David, thank God." "I'm not calling for you," David said, his voice calm, almost gentle in its coldness. "I'm calling because Nina told me Emma's been trying to reach me, and I told her I'd handle this properly instead of through more lawyers." Carol's voice cracked. "David, please, we can fix this. Whatever you want. The house, the money. I'll sign anything." "You already tried signing things for me, Carol. Remember?" Silence on the other end. He let it sit there, the same way she'd let his calls die for 5 years. "The criminal referral isn't mine to withdraw," David continued. "That's between you, Richard, and the DA now. I only controlled what I built. What you did with Richard's money, that's yours to answer for." "Tyler lost his car in front of his entire school," Carol whispered. "Emma won't speak to me. Everything is falling apart." "I know," David said. "It fell apart for me the same way, quietly, completely, with nobody checking if I was okay." He hung up. Emma called 2 days later. This time, David answered. "I've been thinking about what you said," Emma began, her voice smaller than he remembered it. "At the coffee shop, about never asking questions. And I looked at the divorce papers, the actual filing." A long pause. "Your signature's not even close to your real one. I compared it to old birthday cards you used to write to me." David closed his eyes briefly. "Took you long enough." "I'm sorry," Emma said, and for the first time, it sounded real. Not performed, not strategic. "I'm sorry I said that to you at dinner. I'm sorry for 5 years of believing something I never once checked." David was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not going to pretend the last 5 years didn't happen, Emma. I'm not going to pretend the dinner didn't happen either. You don't get instant forgiveness for finally asking a question you should have asked years ago." "I know, but I'm willing to build something new, slowly, honestly, if you actually want that, not because your mother's world is collapsing and you need somewhere else to land." Emma's voice broke. "I want that. I actually want that, Dad." "Then we start from zero," David said. "No assumptions, no history. We earn it back, both of us." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a door left open a crack. More than Carol had ever offered him. Tyler never called. Not that week, not the month after, even as the case against Carol and Richard moved forward. Embezzlement charges, forged signatures, a company's worth of stolen shares finally traced back to their source. Carol lost the house within 4 months. Richard lost considerably more, including his freedom for the better part of 2 years. David didn't attend the sentencing. He didn't need to see it to know it was real. 6 months later, a letter arrived at his apartment. No return address, just familiar handwriting that had gotten shakier with age. Tyler's. "I didn't understand what I did that night. I do now. I'm not asking you to fix anything. I just wanted you to know I remember what I said, and I think about it more than you'd probably guess." David read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not thrown away, not immediately answered either. Some things, he'd learned, couldn't be rebuilt on anyone's timeline but their own. He poured himself a coffee, looked out at a city that had no idea who he used to be or what he'd survived, and allowed himself, for the first time in 5 years, something that felt almost like peace. Not because he'd won, because he'd finally stopped waiting for people who were never going to look for him until it cost them something.